This is Line Tactics presented by Rahvin, where we are going to learn about how to be smart in our line fighting with cohesion using Legos. So please join us for this class. Go ahead and take it away, Rahvin.
Thank you, Leita. Like you said, we're going to look at some line tactics in Belagarth. We've got Legos to help us illustrate our points. And in my opinion, line tactics are one of the most important things that we can pay attention to when we're fighting. There's a lot of times when I see lines line up and I just call the winner before the fight even begins, just because of how the lines are formed. And so I want to share with you a couple of insights that I've had to help you form your own lines well and hopefully have more success when you're fighting. So, first off, we're going to look at some limited front battles. Limited front means that there's only one way that your enemy can come at you. The most common examples of these are bridge battles and castle battles. So, here we have a little castle, and oftentimes when we have the castle, the defending team just lines up in the gap straight across like so, and this isn't very different from just a normal line battle. All we've done is exclude the flankers. And what we do is we create a very even fight between our two little edges of the world here. And so there's two really good ways that we can turn this into an uneven fight. The first, most basic way, and probably the most well-known way, is to use what's called a kill pocket. And you have your fighters line up in this little U shape here. And when the opposing fighters come into your space, they walk into a flanking situation. This way is not bad. It's pretty easy. My only real complaint with the kill pocket is if our attackers get really aggressive and they charge through the middle, this middle can collapse pretty easily, and once this middle breaks, the fight is over. And so that can be pretty unfortunate. So, a line tactic that I really pioneered into Belagarth is something called the caladen formation. And this is my absolute favorite way to fight in a bridge or castle. It's a very interesting setup, and it tends to confuse people, which is just fun. So, while this does work in a castle, we just have to be a little mindful of this gap right here. I'm going to illustrate this on a bridge because that's a little bit easier. So we've got edges of the world like so. Now, the most dramatic thing that you're going to notice straight off the bat is we have a little bit of a slanted line here. And in the caladen, the defending line is quite slanted, between 30 to 45 degrees. So don't be shy, making this a fairly steep angle when you line up. And right here, we have what's called a left caladen. So we've got our left side pushed forward, and the right side is faded back. We can switch that and call it a right caladen. My favorite is the left caladen, and the left caladen is what we use when we have polearm superiority on the defending team. When you have fewer polearms than the other team, then you use the right caladen. A right caladen is much more defensive. So, major themes of this setup. At our point here, we want to have our best fighters, our fighters with the biggest shields, and fighters with the most armor. These guys are going to take the brunt of the fighting. We also want to stack all of our polearms up on the side with the point. So here we've got 4 polearms total. We've got 3 in the point, and we've got 1 in the middle to kind of exert some influence in this area. And what's going to happen is, I should backtrack, going over some more roles. in the caladen, in the back here, are going to be more of your skirmish fighters. So people with small shields, Minreds, Florentine, they're going to fit really well back here. Now, the more skirmishy fighters tend to be really misplaced in a line in a bridge battle because the quarters are tight and polearms just really give them a hard time. And so one of the things that I like about the caladen is that it gives those skirmish fighters a place to go where they can have a constructive role in the team's defense. And that's right back here, away from the heaviest fighting. So, when our attackers come in, we're going to see one of two situations. Situation number one is they come in a line like this, and these sides here engage, and this side is kind of like, what do I do? And they stand around and they aren't very productive. And this is a really good fight for the defensive side because we've got our heavy engagement over here where we intended it to be, where we have all of our polearms stacked up. And the kill-death ratio tends to lean pretty heavily in the favor of the defending side as a result of this. Scenario number two that we can see when our opposing line comes in is that they're going to try to match our line. And when they do this, this is falling into the caladen trap. So they'll try to look like that. And the problem here is we have more polearms on the defending side, and all these polearms can stab directly into people's sword sides, and the person next to them, like this shield, will not cover this person. This person, for our purposes, may as well be fighting without a shield when spears look at him. And people die very quickly when they fall into the caladen trap. So, that makes the caladen very difficult to fight against, and it makes it very fun to fight in. So, let's look at the specific roles of each person in our defense here right now. We've got our mainline fighter, the sword and board. They have two jobs. Their job is to maintain their position in the line and to block arrows. And those are their only two jobs. If they do nothing but that, you're going to have a good time. The caladen is pretty forgiving if this side has to collapse a little bit. So while it's ideal that they maintain their position in the line and keep this slant, it can collapse here a little bit if it has to. The caladen is much less forgiving if this side collapses. So do be mindful of that. We've got our polearm fighters, and their job is to rack up kill counts, and that's all they're there to do. They should not be striking to keep people at distance. They should not be striking at legs. They should not be, stabbing shields to open someone up for something else to hit them. These guys need to be killing, and that's their only job. Preferably killing the opposing polearm fighters first, because once the polearm fighters are gone, the attackers really don't have any chance. One thing to be very careful of, because our shields are not covering each other in a completely ideal manner, archers from over here are going to be shooting into people's swords. So you do have to keep a strong eye out for arrows and block arrows for your buddies. So that is the general idea behind the caladen formation. Please feel free to jump in with any questions as you have them.
I'm monitoring the chat, so I will see them if you type them.
Next up, we're going to look at some basic line formations. So let me get my guys reset up here.
I'll hop in and forgive me if you already said it. The caladen sounds very useful, but like a challenging thing to make people who you don't necessarily practice with on a regular basis, like most of our line fights would be, to make happen. Is this something you would attempt to do in a line fight, or would you reserve it primarily for like unit fights with people who you can, strategize?
So your observation is accurate. I have organized this on the fly in a bridge battle, but it hopes that you get to line your team up before Leon is called, and that's really integral. If you had a very organized team, then you could do this during an open field battle, but that takes a lot of coordination, and that is a big challenge. So when I've done this in bridge battles with people outside of my unit, which is pretty much going to be the case every time, which is why I make videos like this. You gotta talk fast and explain things in very simple sentences, so that way people are on the same page. But yeah, once it happens, you can generally be successful with it.
Anya has a question regarding the role of lefty fighters in a caladen formation. Specifically, if lefty fighters can be used to better defend, or rather, be on the aggressor side of things. So
on the aggressive side?
Yeah, I think she's referring to what you're talking about, how the spears then come in on people's sword sides instead of their shield sides. So how does a lefty fighter play into the dynamics of the caladen formation?
Oh, yeah. So if I was a left-handed person and I was attacking a caladen, I would probably try to get into the middle-ish section and take up some space in the middle. So that way the spear in the middle of the caladen formation can't just have free reign to kind of flank in on the point. That's where I would position a left-handed fighter.
So their observation is correct, that putting a lefty there in the middle reduces the effectiveness of the caladen formation?
Yes. Especially when fighting against a left caladen, a left-handed person is going to have a hard time fighting on one of the points. Okay, excellent question. So let's look at some basic elements of line fighting. So this is a pretty standard looking line countering another line. These look really nice. Let's start messing them up so that we see where the mistakes are. So things that we do not want to see when we are line fighting. We do not want to see the flying V from the Mighty Ducks. This person dies. That's all. The only thing he can do is die. And then your middle starts collapsing. These guys get engaged. These guys aren't doing anything useful because they're away from the enemy. The enemy starts flanking you because you gave away positioning. This is the worst. Don't do the flying V. Unfortunately, we do see it sometimes. One thing that always frustrates me when I'm fighting is we'll often get something that looks like this. And I will be a spearman in the middle of a line holding roughly a 12-foot gap. That is not ideal. This is actually the sole reason why I started carrying a sword with my shield, or a sword with my spear, was so that I could almost do something in this position. I'm not sure what the logic is behind this, but it happens all the time. So, like, if you have a shield, like, be mindful of the gaps and stretch the line thinner if you have to close those. But yeah, gaps happen all the time, and they are a big exploit. We also don't want to see any bowls when we're fighting. So a bowl could be kind of a gentle looking flying V. This is not ideal. These people will struggle to have a productive role, and these guys are going to fight, and there's no real defending if polearms come in like this, and this bowled out area is going to die. Conversely, same thing for a bowl that bowls in on its own line. What's going to happen here? These guys aren't going to have a productive role because they are withdrawn from the fight, and your flanks are going to have a hard time. So you always want to be maximizing the number of weapons that you're presenting onto the enemy at any given time. So if you got a 3-on-3 fight, and let's just illustrate this off to the side real quick. If you've got a 3-on-3 fight, it's much better to fight them like this, and it's much worse to fight them like that. You got to get weapons onto the enemy. All right. One other really interesting thing that we see in Belegarth lines is what I call the floating fighter. And you'll have a fighter, and he does this. And he thinks that he's being very active. He's like, look at me. I'm fighting the entire team all by myself. I'm so cool. And two things usually happen. Number one, he dies. There is no protecting him from polearms, missiles, 3-on-1 fights. He's going to have a really hard time. The second thing that happens, which is very tough, is we'll have our line advancing in at a reasonable pace, trying to keep up with him. And our lines engage, and these fighters, they go, oh man, I'm behind this guy, I'm not doing any good. And so they either struggle to find a place in the line because there's no room for them, or they split. And then this guy, he dies because he's fighting one on everyone. And then we have a gap. And then people go through our gap, and everything just falls apart. And it's very tempting to fight everyone, but you really have to realize that it's kind of throwing the fight, because your people get mispositioned and they're not having productive roles because they're trying to get around you, and then when you die, it leaves a gap in the line, and that gap is often slow to heal, so it creates big exploits, and it's a big problem. So those are some of the basics of line fighting. You want your lines to have no gaps. You want them to be mostly straight-ish. And you don't want anyone being unproductive. Now, if you want to do something more aggressive, this is not a straight line, but it is a productive line in that everyone's engaged and your flanks are pushing aggressively on the opponents, trying to make them go a little bit like this and form into a large line-sized bowl. And that's about the only time that a non-straight line is going to be really effective. So, one thing that I'm often yelling at when we're advancing on the opponents is form a straight line. And oftentimes you yell that at your team and they will hear you somewhat, and then they'll form a straight line. And so yeah, feel free to be vocal with your team. Sometimes they need reminding, sometimes they can't see what's going on. and you communicate with your team in that manner, and oftentimes you'll have a much better fight. So, next up, we're going to talk about some counterflanking. So, feel free to jump in with questions while I am setting stuff up.
I guess you already touched on what I was wondering, which was infighting communication. So is that like form a straight line? Is that the main communication that you find necessary, or are there any other phrases that are useful?
Yeah, that's a big one. I also tend to yell out, like, there's a gap here, come close it. And one of the nice things, when you have a spear, you A, have reach, and you B, have non-striking surfaces. So, what I'll do is I'll go, hey, you, close this gap. And they'll be like, oh, there's a gap over here. And they'll come over. And that can be very helpful. So, yeah, definitely communicate with your team. A bunch of times I'll tap people. Like, I'll tap someone and say, we can't protect you there. You need to back up. And then that gets their attention, and they back up. So, yeah, it's very easy to get lost in the Velagarth chaos. So, communication goes a long ways towards helping that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about counterflanking. I have seen some really bad counterflanking tactics out there, and so we want to debunk some of those. Number one, we've got our flanker, and he wants to get around our line, and he wants to hit everyone in the back, particularly the people in the middle. He doesn't really care about these people. He's after those ones. And I see this happen all the time. This guy, he gets it in his mind, he's going to flank. He comes around, and this person stands there. And I don't really understand what's going on in that person's mind. That is definitely not an ideal response. So watch out for that. If someone does that, then you go ahead and take the flank. Response number two that we often see. This guy will try to flank, and he'll do this. And this person, he sees the guy trying to flank, but his response isn't very aggressive. He does this. And while that keeps him safe and lets him know that this guy has eyes on him, this guy doesn't really care if he turns. He's not interested in fighting this guy in the flank. He wants to hit these people in the back. So he'll just continue going around, and then he'll leave and hit them in the back. And so that isn't a very productive response either. We've got a third very common response, probably one of the most common, and that's where this guy starts aggressing on the flank. This person addresses the flanker, but I don't know if he's worried he won't win the fight. Maybe he's worried about dying. The problem is he'll give ground before the flanker. And what happens here is the flanker says, cool, I don't really care about you. I want to hit those guys in the back. So once this gets backed up a little bit, he now has achieved the backfill that he wanted to. He leaves and he goes and kills people in the back. And this is a very dangerous response on behalf of the defending team, in that the team thought that this guy was engaging our flanker, but in reality, all this guy did was give the flanker the real estate he wanted, and then he turned and he hit people who thought a problem was dealt with in the back. So while this person is trying his best, we've got to watch out, because that is a very unfortunate response to a flanker that really doesn't help his team. So there are two really good responses that we can make to a flanker. Response number one. Our flanker comes out. Our person floats out to meet him. Our flanker, not wanting to get into a fight, but wanting to flank, continues flanking. This guy continues floating. He continues flanking. he continues floating. And we'll note that this fighter is staying even with his line. If he backs up, then this flanker has a gap to shoot, and he can get in. So he's staying even with his line, which is the most important thing here. He'll stay maybe a step to the inside of this guy, so that way if he tries to run around, he's got a much longer way to run, and it's easier for him to keep up, even if he's a slower runner. The thing that we really don't want to see is called like cutting in. So if we get into this position where he's really worried about this flanker coming around, but he neglects that the flanker can just go this way. And if this flanker is a faster runner than he is, then that tactic is going to work. So we'll want our counter flanker to stay just a little bit to the inside of the flanker and even with the line. And this is often a successful counterflank because many times this guy doesn't want to get into a direct engagement. He's really worried about losing his legs. He's looking for positioning. And as long as this person is active and smart about it and does not give him the positioning he wants, then that is a successful counterflank. One thing that we really have to watch out for, if there are two flankers, then we've got what's called the pin and split. This guy will engage this one, the counterflanker, directly, and then this guy will just shoot the gap. So if you have a 2-on-1 flank, this guy needs to make sure to get vocal and yell at this guy to be either watching the gap or to get over there and help address the second person. All right. The second productive way of countering a flanker is to get really aggressive on them. So you'll see this flanker and they'll often start running. And rather than just meeting them even with your line, this person meets them here. And this is my preferred way to meet a flanker. You meet them in the middle and you force a conclusion to your conflict. Like you make it so one of you dies. If you kill him, then fantastic. You have excellent field positioning, and his flanking tactic really bit his team in the back. However, maybe he wins, and if he wins and you die, then your team has a very good visual of you having died. They see this they see this flanker coming in, and then they can address them. If you're dying all the way over here, that's outside of your team's line of vision, and this flanker can come in. So if I'm going to die, I want to die where people can see me, and then they can know what happened and make plans. If you think you're going to die to the flanker, then go ahead and sacrifice yourself to take the leg. When the flanker is all the way out here, that's really kind of the same as killing him in that he can no longer flank, and that's what you needed to stop. So if you're unconfident in that fight, just focus on taking the leg, and that will do big favors to your team, even if you end up dying in that exchange. All right, so next up, we're going to move on to what I call the shade trap. Feel free to jump in with questions about flanking as I get this set up.
So I think you answered my question, but I'll just clarify my understanding, which was, here I am, I see so-and-so's flanking. I know that either so-and-so is better at fighting than I am, or equal, and there's a good chance I'll end up dying. Your recommendation is either engage aggressively and aim for legs so that we prevent them from obtaining their goal?
Yes. Or float out and waste as much time as you possibly can. Because a slow flanker is not a very effective flanker.
Sounds doable.
Ameldier, can you clarify for me, is the full range of the battle map on screen again?
I think it might be a mobile issue. Maybe I've just got a little square, so I can see like the main line, but when he was moving the flankers off, it was like way off screen.
Sorry about that.
I mean, if it's a mobile thing, then nothing that you guys can fix. So.
Well,
Okay, I was just trying to make sure we're not screwing up the video.
obviously that flanker knew what he was on about if he got off the screen.
Yeah.
All right, so this is a situation that we see just about every single year at Chaos Wars. I call this one the Shade Trap. And what'll happen is it'll be a bright, sunny Chaos Wars day, and it'll be in the evening. You've got your field tree, and it's casting a shadow. So our shadow is blue. And then right back here, we've got Edge of the World. And all of these fighters, they like fighting in the shade. It's comfortable. And, like, they don't care if they fight in the shade here, here. As long as he's fighting in the shade, he's a happy battleground. And then you've got the people fighting in the sun. And often what happens is you'll see new people coming onto the field, and they're like, man, do I fight in the sun or do I fight in the shade? They want to fight in the shade. And so this side will massively outnumber the sun side. Yet, when Leon is called, you will repeatedly see the sun side just thrash the shade team. And so I want to look at how that happens a little bit. These people, they're fighting in the sun. Doesn't matter if this person fights in the sun here. Doesn't matter if they fight in the sun here. Indifferent to them. So they'll go ahead, and after Leon is called, they will actively get to choose their field positioning against a team that is inactively sitting in place. And we end up with this situation. And this is a completely lost position for the Shade team. I have been in fights where the Shade team outnumbered the Sun team, like probably 3-2. I've been in fights where all the best fighters were on the Shade team, and the Sun team was made up of, just average fighters, none of the big name standouts. And the Sun team wins these fights repeatedly. So, when you're at Chaos Wars, you got to watch out for this. When you are having lines engage each other, you really want to have favorable positioning. And the Sun team, in this case, has achieved it. So, to counter this, the Shade team really needs to become the stand in the shade while in between fights, and then fight in the sun when Leon is called, and meet the other team in at least an even manner that doesn't let them just get around to the sides.
We have a comment come in that is harnessing the power of the sun.
That's right.
All caps.
So, I have always found that to be an interesting happenstance, and really shows how you can have a fight with fewer people play out favorably for them just through superior field positioning. All right, we're going to set up one more scenario to look at, and jump in with questions if you have them.
Any questions or snarky comments about the Shade Trap?
Okay, so next up, we've got what I like to call having a push team or a push side and a stay alive side. So, oftentimes when we are fighting, you will have one flank that is just rocking it, and one flank that's doing okay. So in this example, this flank is doing really good. This flank is doing really good. And these sides are just doing okay. So when you see that your side has, numbers advantage, fighter quality advantage, maybe a favorable weapon mix advantage, then you need to recognize that you are on the win side of your line. And your job is to kill all the other people quickly, come around, and win the fight. Ideally, you're going to do it faster than their win side does. Because if one side starts lacking, then that's just wasting time. When this happens, these people need to recognize that they are not the win side. They are the stay alive side. And so their job is going to be stay alive as long as possible, try to die slowly, fight defensively, and waste time over here so that your win side can push through and win the fight for you. Oftentimes, you see what I like to call clustered fighting. So we'll have something that looks like this, where you've got your line and your people are not distributed uniformly. They're clustered. And this can either be very good or it can be very bad. If these people are fighting and they're being slackers and they've got a 6-on-3 advantage, if they aren't pushing that advantage, then this side with their 7-on-4 advantage, they're going to win. So when you see clusters like this, you'll want to be mindful. Identify if your cluster is actually pushing to win. If they are, and that's working out, then excellent. If they are not pushing to win, then try to get them to distribute themselves a little bit more reasonably. Otherwise, this is just a lot of people not living up to their full potential and not winning fights. So, those are some of the elements of line fighting that I have noticed most commonly that I wanted to share with you. Let me know if you have any last questions. Otherwise, we'll start wrapping this up.
So I think we have time for one more topic if you wanted to pull from the sub list.
Oh.
You've got about 15 minutes.
Okay. No, I think we'll be okay. All right. So yeah, next time you're in a Belagarth fight. Oh.
We had an unmute.
Excellent.
I do have a question.
Okay.
So I'm in Stygia, and we're skirmishers, and it's really frustrating because we can't get any line fighting practice. Do you have any recommendations for working with skirmishers in a tactful sort of way?
So what I like to do is manipulate them without them knowing it. So in my realm, we have a fight that we like to call the Viking Alehouse Brawl. And it's a fun time. And Edge of the World is hard. The idea being that so we've got, here in yellow is our Viking Alehouse. The idea is that on the walls are shields with horns and spikes, so if you hit the wall, then you die. And what we do, it's kind of like a sideways bridge battle. And what I do is I create a very tight field, and we force people to fight in lines. When you do this, you gotta remind everyone to be very mindful of their headshots, because they can happen. So remind people every once in a while to watch out for that. But otherwise, it's a lot of fun. People tend to have a really good time with this one. It's also a really good way to get high engagement out of a smaller realm attendance. And you can always sell it as, we've got to prep for Chaos Wars, so we need to learn how to fight packed in and close together like this. So, yeah, having a realm of skirmishers can be a challenge when you want to study line fighting. This is probably the solution I would go with.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for attending. I hope that this class can help you look at your line formation before the fight is called, and then kind of let you know what adjustments you need to be made, or what some of the things that you are that you can look for to make your line be more successful.
Thank you so much. I always enjoy your classes.